gamers sought prey on the weak and impressionable, who in turn worshipped them as gods. Calling themselves the White Mantle, these converts sacrificed innocents and toppled the Crichton monarchy.
One of the biggest and most radical additions to Heart of Thorns was that of raiding. And it's funny because if you cast your mind back, you'll remember it wasn't even ready for the initial release and had to be dropped in shortly after. It's been a polarizing topic in many ways, and I just knew I'd have to include something about it on my review. But for me, I've always been fairly clear about where I stand with raids in Guild Wars 2. And that is that for the invested and long-term Guild Wars 2 mono gamers, raiding saved Heart of Thorns.
I think you need new challenges that are way beyond anything that you've ever faced in Guild Wars 2 before. What do you think about that? Yeah. And how about not just the ultimate challenge, but the ultimate group challenge? Is that what you want?
Now, already, depending on the kind of player you are, you'll find you may be enthusiastically nodding or immediately put off by what I just said. And I think that's honestly okay. It's a bold statement, and what people are looking for in their MMO is going to be wildly different person to person. Guild Wars 2 has the advantage of still tailoring the vast majority of its PvE content to non-raiders. I do maintain, though, that for those of us who play this game as a mainstay and strive to experience as much stuff in it as we can, raiding's been incredible. It's the singular feature to have given me the absolute most playtime of all others when we look at what Heart of Thorns was initially advertising. Considering the progression of a first clear, the repeat and smoother clears that you do on later weeks, the time making and practicing new builds, the making of new friends and coming together as teams, it all adds to an enormous number of hours in Guild Wars 2 that the game just didn't support until Heart of Thorns.
According to the intelligence, this cave system leads deeper into the complex.
Beyond just playtime, I'll go one further. I think raiding didn't just save Heart of Thorns, but I think it is the strongest PvE experience that has ever existed in the franchise. This is coming from a 7,000 hour old Guild Wars 1 vet who experienced an enormous variety of solo and lone man farms at that game's endgame, speed clears and elite endgame content all over GW1. It can be hard to separate the nostalgia from the fact when it comes to looking at the prequel game, and sure, GW1 had a lot of aspects of buildcraft and team composition that were leagues ahead of its sequel, but I really don't think it hit the individual encounter complexity, story delivery, or moment-to-moment gameplay experience that Guild Wars 2 raiding, that Heart of Thorns raiding, is able to give. Particularly as someone who enjoys both the high-end gameplay, the challenge, and the team-oriented play, and as someone who is immensely into the lore and story of this franchise, raiding has hit both sweet spots for me wonderfully. Particularly comparing the story delivery in Guild Wars 2 raids versus the story delivery of the rest of Guild Wars 2 is amazing to me. Take for example the fact that it is so rare for core Tyria or a lot of living world content that Guild Wars 2 will ever create a bespoke environment to tell its story. In most of this MMO, when you're experiencing story content, it's just happening in some reused or repurposed bland area of an open world map. Well, not in raids. Here we have linear and tailor-made regions of the world made for nothing other than to tell a single story and provide challenge. Every prop, every monster, every side achievement or interactable object are all there to support that one narrative. And it's captivating in a way that the rest of Guild Wars 2 very rarely ever manages to be. The game type is even supported by an audio system not seen elsewhere, whereby all 10 different players in the party have a chance for their characters to make quips or have little conversations with one another about what is currently happening, depending on their race or their class. The developers have really supported this content. There are full complements of voice acting, unique enemies and locations and side objectives that all build together to make for something absolutely fantastic. That's not to mention the actual stories they've chosen to tell too. In particular, the Bastion of the Penitent is about as good as it gets, opting to tell the conclusion to a long-standing, hanging story thread from the original game. Actual closure on something lore enthusiasts have been curious about for years, all the while remaining firmly in the territory of being a side story that people don't need to experience in order to enjoy the rest of the game. And it's propped up lastly by the challenge. I think one of the big reasons I enjoy story in raids is how brutally difficult and menacing the threats you find in these areas of the world are. Take the experience of fighting Morgemoth, the final boss of Heart of Thorns, versus even a small filler boss in the first raid wing, Gorseval. I can only begin to compare the difference between my emotional state the first time I beat each of these guys. Morgemoth, who had an entire expansion and Living World season of build up and hype to this eventual boss battle, but was handily defeated with very little challenge, I can barely remember. Gorseval though, and the cries of elation between myself and the 10 other nerds I killed it with in TeamSpeak at the time, I remember very clearly. Moving on from story, there are a plethora of other things about raids to have impressed me since their inception. Raids tend to be the testing ground for entirely new Guild Wars 2 mechanics like fixation or special action hotkeys, and those often end up being so fun they make their way into the rest of the game. Unlike in other MMOs, the developers always tried to be as mindful as possible about removing RNG from raiding gameplay, and while some bugs and unforeseen situations can definitely arise, they're not common. Then when players truly excel at raiding and they defeat content in totally wild or unimaginable ways, bypassing many mechanics even, the developers have been comfortable enough and confident enough in their product to let those special strategies continue to exist, opting not to nerf them and encouraging the community to think creatively about future encounters to be added to the game. Guild Wars 2 raiding is better than raiding in a lot of other MMOs by the way it's paired with the fact this MMO is not necessarily power creeping people anymore. Level 80 and level 80 ascended gear is the max. I can still go long after it had originally released into Wing 1 and experience real progression and challenge there without it being completely undermined by the passage of time and everybody becoming far too powerful for it. Even the reward systems have been intelligently executed, with random item drops for that classic cross your fingers and hope for the best experience, but coupled with a currency system that guarantees even the most unlucky of players will eventually be able to buy the item they're working towards. Raiding has introduced space for classes to play in roles they never could in Guild Wars 2 before, like toughness tanking and playing dedicated supports. I could go on, but it's all led to the fostering of a now flourishing community that never could have existed before Heart of Thorns. There are a vast number of people who Guild Wars 2 finally retains that through 2012, 2013, 2014, and most of 2015 were hemorrhaging out, complaining that this was a title with no endgame. Well, not anymore. Guild Wars 2 does have an endgame, and if that's what you were looking for, Heart of Thorns has finally put us in that place. Let's go back to something I was alluding to at the start of this video, and that's what raiding in general means to the Guild Wars 2 community. And this is also another place where the raiding team has impressed me with their handling of this content. Let's be blunt, raids are not for everyone. They are a distinct, difficult, sometimes exclusionary, heavy time investment. That means that many people will be put off them right at the door, despite everything I just said. I feel that Guild Wars 2 as a general MMO has often struggled when it comes to situations like this. With regard to the handling of the game over the years, there's been a tendency for ArenaNet to make their content cater to as many people as possible, even when the situation doesn't quite call for it. Don't get me wrong, accessibility is awesome, and this franchise has, in many respects, made that notion its legacy. But instead of embracing that the bad sometimes comes with the good, I've often found that Guild Wars 2's vision has become compromised. The experience eventually presented at the end of the road bland or anodyne. But so far, that's not been true with raids, and this is something that impresses me immeasurably. The raiding team has stuck to their guns and been clear about what they're making and who they're making it for, and I have a lot of respect for that. There are definitely a lot of people who don't like the look of raiding, and instead of diluting the presented experience down to try and entice those people in, Guild Wars 2's raids seem to be totally okay with not having them play that aspect of the game, instead pushing out Living World patches with much more accessible content for those players to enjoy instead. Raids are uncompromising. They're tough as nails to learn, and that's what they're meant to be. If you like the sound of that, then that's a huge value add to Heart of Thorns. I think for most games, this area of raid discussion would just end there. Raiding just might not be for some people, and that's okay. But for this franchise, it goes much deeper. See, There's a fair amount of talk when Heart of Thorns released, suggestive of the notion that Guild Wars 2 had somehow lost its soul by embracing this sort of content. These sort of comments floated about not because they were a real assessment of the quality of raids or their accessibility, but I think rather because of the core ideas behind what Guild Wars 2 was always seeming to be. Guild Wars 2, and especially Guild Wars 1, were both online games made in reaction to typical MMO trends. These were games that deliberately tempted themselves away from the standard and said, no, we can do better. No to competing for loot or gathering nodes. No to excessive grind just to complete story. No to mounts. No to excessively flashy skins. And so when Heart of Thorns said yes to raids, a kind of content that many had been burnt out from other MMOs over, it was bound to rock the boat. It seemed so contrary to whatever it was the developers had been setting up 10 years ago, like the water had now been poisoned. Whether you think these criticisms are warranted, to me, I think it's important to look at the content itself, and I honestly do believe it's the height of this franchise's PvE, both games included. Further to the point, it's important to understand that ArenaNet always wanted some kind of challenging endgame content for Guild Wars 2, but that they had horrendously missed the mark in 2012. Considering the difficulty of some Guild Wars 1 content and pre-release developer interviews about GW2's dungeons, I don't view the announcement of raiding for Heart of Thorns as any kind of aberration or bait and switch. It was the final arrival at a content stream the developers had always been aiming for. Their biggest compromise to me has been the shift to 10-man instead of 5-man, for fairly blunt and arbitrary reasons. If you're interested in more of this discussion, you can check the description for a link now to watch a dedicated video I made on this just last year, complete with specific examples of exactly what I'm talking about. The biggest area of disappointment over raids since Heart of Thorns released for most players, for those that play them, is not anything to do with how hard or inaccessible they are. It's likely actually skill balance. Skill balance and what is meta can have a huge impact on how many people enjoy raiding, perhaps much more so than any other part of the PvE game. While the developers have done well to not power creep players so hard that raids are suddenly too easy, there have been much more than a few patches over the year that have affected raiding in a very negative way. Changes such as the Elementalist fire cooldowns being altered, thus breaking some of the class's fluidity, or particularly some boon duration related changes in late 2016 have caused much outcry. Often these are balance changes that appear to have been made with entirely separate game types like World vs. World or PvP in mind, and that can be incredibly frustrating to think about when you purely play raids. Toward the ends of 2016, ArenaNet have made very visible effort to split their skill balance according to game type, so a PvP motivated skill balance will only hit PvP. And while this is exactly the solution many of us have been asking for, the downside is now that there are very infrequent balance updates on specific areas of the game, so raiding will be stuck with a meta for many months at a time, and if that meta means that Revenant isn't particularly strong, well, Revenant's going to be sitting on the sideline for a long damn time. Rather than discussing every little change and why it may have been made since Heart of Thorns came out for the balance, which would take way too long, I'd rather look at one of many specific issues, and it's a broader one. This is an issue that is especially on my mind considering how long it seems to take for them to push any raid-focused balance patches, and that's the issue of the current super comp. Of course, every iteration of raiding in Guild Wars 2 will have an established meta, the 10 best classes and builds that synergize with one another that you can choose to raid with, and it will give you the easiest experience in clearing that content. This I don't dispute. There will always be an established meta. It's inevitable that the average players, uninformed players, and lazy players will always pigeon themselves into these builds based on minor mathematic discrepancies, and I see a lot of futility in trying to fight that. No, what's important to me is that this meta, whatever it might be, this super comp, is fun to play and leaves space for at least one of each of the classes in the game. There are 9 different classes in Guild Wars 2 and 10 slots in a raiding group, so having one of each class available to play is more than possible and should be how it's handled, right? Well, sadly, that hasn't been the case for a very long time. Of these 10 slots, many groups will find themselves doubling up, tripling, or even quadrupling up on the same few classes depending on the meta. You'll have like 2 warriors, 2 druids, 2 mesmers, 4 elementalists. This invariably has left other classes like the engineer on the sidelines, and that's a dangerous thing when it means if you're an engineer, you're probably not going to be raiding and might end up quitting Guild Wars 2 altogether over it. To be fair, re-rolling to alternate characters isn't exactly hard in this game, but what's mystifying about this super comp situation is that we're only in it because ArenaNet have designed it that way. The reason why people took 2 warriors, for example, for a really long time was because each warrior could only provide his damage enhancing buffs and boons to some of his allies instead of all 10. So this forces people to take 2 warriors to cover all 10 people at once. And it's the same for chronomancers and the same pretty much everywhere you look. Many of these buffs are absolutely essential to clear the content, so we're being forced to double up. Bizarrely, when ArenaNet were asked why they didn't allow these boons and buffs to affect all 10 allies at once, thus forever opening up many more classes for use, they explained that it was because they didn't want to create a super comp. This just makes no sense to me. There was always going to be a super comp, it's just that the one they've artificially enforced now, through this limiting, has much less room for different skills, builds, and players to engage with it. No, rather, I think it's just that they were lazy when introducing raids and didn't want to assess the fact that so much of their skill balance would need to be updated for a 10-man scenario, since 5-man parties were all we had before Heart of Thorns. And at that point, when it was too late and we've realized we've crippled build diversity, they've now realized there are technical and server issues that are restricting them further. This all just builds to more reasons why I dislike the fact we moved to 10-man, which really wasn't necessary, and spits in the face of some of their early stances when Guild Wars 2 was released, that if you have 5-man content, it's easier to find teams and more visible how you are impacting the encounters. It strikes me we just went to 10-man so that they could label it something differently, raids, and hopefully sell more copies of the expansion, even though the whole thing was kind of arbitrary and has left us in this horrible balance situation. In general, despite this big glaring issue, I would not say ArenaNet have done a truly terrible job with balance passes. Things could be far worse. There's simply a lot to talk about in the established community, and those who are really impassioned will speak very loudly about the areas of balance they don't like, and it's important to keep that in mind. Especially some of the more recent balance patches, I think the devs have been smart, and there have been a few changes to address this 5-man boon buff situation, and instead making them 10-man. We still have a long way to go, but I think the devs have identified these issues, and who knows, in another year or so, or by the time the next Guild Wars 2 expansion comes out, we may see that the raiding meta is nothing but better than where it is today. So that's raiding. That's endgame in Guild Wars 2 as of today, with fractals and their continual improvements and updates and challenge motes, hopefully holding up the 5-man end of the game. Some people do still regret that dungeons as a format have been moved away from, but as I've explained in a previous video, I'm really not sure what dungeons can provide that fractals can't. So generally speaking, I think Heart of Thorns has done pretty damn well. Raids may not be for everyone, but if raids is something that you think you enjoy, Heart of Thorns has done nothing but deliver an incredible new area of the game that I am thoroughly positive about. Endgame is something we can genuinely say Guild Wars 2 now has, and for far, far too long, that just wasn't true. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you on the next episode of the review series. We don't have many big new areas to talk about, and the last of them really is going to be PvP side stuff. So join me next time for World vs. World and PvP. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.